Welcome to Leadership and Life Chat with your hosts, me, Becky Ames.
And me, Mark Curtis. In each episode, we'll be illustrating how success in leadership is inextricably linked with success in life.
Whether it's leadership in business, society, family or friends, we're all leaders.
Using our experiences and a range of expert guests, we'll share secrets to boosting your health, wealth and self.
So let's get on with the show.
Anxiety is something which we talk about a lot in business. We hear it a lot in the news. It's everywhere. But is anxiety always a bad thing? And do we really understand how it works? And as leaders, what we need to do to understand it more? Today's guest, Garath Symonds, has released a book called The Anxious Leader and is here to talk us through it. So Garath, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
You're most welcome and thank you for joining us. Before we get into the main topic today, which is the anxious leader, do you want to just tell the listeners a little bit about your backstory and how you got to this point?
Sure. Obviously a big question. I'll give you a sort of a breached answer. I started my career off in youth work as a youth and community worker, working in quite sort of difficult neighbourhoods, mostly in the north of England, but also in London, with young people at sort of risk of crime and got involved in quite sort of antisocial behaviour. And I guess I look back on that thinking that how did I end up there? And I think I was, on reflection, trying to repair something that happened in my own adolescence that I was going back to try and sort of repair. But I moved on from that into management. It's the management of youth services and services for children and young people, education, safeguarding, and ended up in quite sort of senior roles in local government, public sector, also working in charities. So I could probably describe my background as sort of public sector leadership, where I sort of led a lot of change and was responsible for sort of big areas of service and large sort of staff teams. And then that sort of came to something of an end. And as a sort of, I kind of went sort of part-time and sort of worked as a consultant in local government still, but also as an executive coach. And I retrained in 2018 in executive coaching at a place called the Tavistock, which is a well-known sort of mental health trust, but also world-renowned in the sort of study of organizational life and leadership. Over the last sort of 8 decades have been sort of researching and consulting in organizations. And that led me onto sort of a career in executive coaching and consulting. And I'm still really, really enjoying it.
Brilliant. Well, that sounds really fascinating. Now, what a mixed bag of experiences you've had. What we're here to talk about today, Garath, is your book, which is The Anxious Leader, and the lessons which you've learned through not only your own experiences, but also from the Tavistock training that you've had as well. So just to set the scene, did you want to tell the listeners a little bit more about what you mean by the anxious leader and why you believe it's so important?
Yeah. Well, just before I do that, just to say, it started out as a blog. But basically, I thought I'd do a bit of writing and also prepare for an assessment course I was doing in mountain leadership. And so I went to spend a lot of the time in the Welsh mountains and a lot of time sort of either at home or in Wales writing, and started writing this blog. And it just grew and grew and grew. And I thought, this is not a blog. This is something else. I guess on reflection, I noticed, thinking about my own leadership career, how much anxiety played a part, how it made me do things and stopped me from doing things. And when I think about some of the mistakes and maybe some of the successes, I can see how anxiety and my attempts to avoid it or fight against it in some way often would sabotage my leadership. That reflection over some years really sort of coincided with my training as the Tavistock that you mentioned, and the role of anxiety really features sort of quite prevalently in sort of what we call system psychodynamics, and how we as individuals and as groups and organizations defend against anxiety. So the idea of being an anxious leader doesn't sound very attractive, does it? Who wants to be an anxious leader? But it struck me that I may have been one, and may have been in this sort of constant relationship with anxiety, but actually never really stopping to reflect and make meaning of my experience and to sort of think, what does this anxiety mean? What is it telling me about myself? What is it telling me about the group that I'm in? And what is it telling me about the wider system? And how can I use it as data or information that might inform how I what I do next, or how I lead, or how I show up, or how I present myself in different contexts. So the subheading of the book is how to navigate anxiety in an uncertain world. And it strikes me that we're living in a great deal of uncertainty in the 21st century, sort of globally and organizationally. The triggers for anxiety are all there for us. So being more, what I call in the book, anxiety aware. So you can see how you defend against anxiety and how your organization is defending against anxiety. Seemed to me to be some helpful knowledge. Wanted to explore some of the skills that you might employ and some of the ways of leading that you might employ to navigate anxiety more successfully.
That sounds absolutely fascinating, Gareth, and we're going to dive into that. But before we do so, one of the things you said at the start of that section there was systems psychodynamics.
Yeah.
And I'm naive to what that is, and I'm sure hopefully maybe a lot of our listeners are as well. Would you like to just expand on that first, so we've all got an understanding of sort of what it is and what approach we're looking at here?
Yeah, sure. Well, the other term for system psychodynamic is the Tavistock tradition or the Tavistock approach, which sounds a little bit better, but is also quite elusive in terms of what it might mean. I absolutely love this approach, but from a marketing perspective, it's rubbish because it just sounds sort of jargony and technical, and it's like, oh my god, what's that? And you may have had that reaction. And so system psychodynamic really is a way of looking and understanding organizations that is both systemic and psychodynamic. So what I mean by that, or what's meant by that, is when we think systemically, we think about the structure of an organization, how an organization is organized, the teams and the boundaries of different teams, different functions, different activities that are in the organization, but also its task, what we call the primary task, the task that it was set up to accomplish, or the thing that it has to do in order to survive is another way of seeing it. And within the still on that sort of structural or systems part of the thinking, we think about roles that people take up, how those roles contribute to the task. The other side is the psychodynamic or the psychoanalytical aspect of the approach, which is much more about culture and behavior and attitudes and emotions, and crucially those emotions that we can't see, that described as sort of unconscious. So how our unconscious shows up in individuals and groups and entire organizations, and how it can affect the behavior and the culture and the climate of that organization, often to its detriment. And these two approaches, these two ideas of sort of thinking structurally or systemically, but also thinking psychoanalytically, are infused. So it's not like we think systemically and psychoanalytically. It's thinking about, well, what happens emotionally at the boundary of organization? So what happens when we create a silo in an organization? So silo is a great term, isn't it? And some organizations will describe themselves as siloed, where one department won't talk to the other department. We're a siloed organization. We need some help with breaking down silos. When you start looking at an organization, what you realize is the silo is in the mind. There's no actual silo. There's no physical walls stopping you from talking to the person in that department. And sometimes you find teams who are literally meters apart, or may even be sharing the same working space. But because of that organization in the mind, because of that silo in their head, they don't talk to the other person. So it's trying to think, well, what is that? What does that mean? How does structure and emotion and our relationship to things like team boundaries, what meaning does that have? And how might it evoke anxiety in someone that might repel someone from walking over the other side of the room and saying, hi, can you help me with this, or whatever it is? I don't know if that makes any sort of sense in terms of your own experience of working in organizations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, massive. I think the interesting thing, loads of interesting things coming out of that, Gareth, but as you were talking there, it just made me think, and a conversation I was having the other day with some of my fellow partners, which is, however we try and simplify decision making within a business, I think within a lot of businesses, there's a lack of systems thinking. So everything has a reaction. It's going to have a knock-on effect to something else. So even if you are even if you've got these perceived silos, decisions which are taken and things which happen in one of the silos is going to have an effect on another silo, whether they like it or not. It's a bit like the ecosystem, isn't it? If one country decides to do something which pollutes the atmosphere, it doesn't just stop above that country. It moves around the world on the trade winds, jet streams, blah, blah, blah. And we end up with impacts in different places which were unexpected.
Sure.
And it's no different. I don't think it's any different to a business. Businesses are complex, moving creatures, but we don't treat them like that.
Absolutely. I think that, what you're talking about is a sort of another aspect of systemic thinking where things are connected and linked. Something that changes in one part of the system will have an impact, perhaps an unintended impact in another part of the system. And decisions can sort of flush that out. So you make a decision and you think, I'm making a decision about this scope of this part of the organization, but actually the result of that decision pops up somewhere else, unintended and unexpected. I write about decisions in the book and decision-making processes. They're often quite anxiety-provoking events in that what a decision does is it sort of commits you to an uncertain future. And people often avoid making decisions, and they have all sorts of ways that go beyond normal good governance, but really have the sort of hidden or subtle intention of not actually making a decision at all, or trying not to be the one that makes the decision and pushing it somewhere else because it's too difficult for me to be with.
That really resonates what you said there, Gareth, about the working in silos and the decision impacts on every other part of the business potentially, because ultimately each part is a cog, isn't it, of the machine that is driving the business forwards. If those decisions aren't taken, then we don't move forwards. It's very easy to stand still. We really do need to think about it. And I was just thinking, when you're a relatively small business, it's quite easy to keep all those parts talking to each other, isn't it? But as soon as you get bigger and bigger, how you maintain those channels of communication and make sure that everyone's brought into decisions, or not, as the case may be, or perhaps everyone still wants to be involved in every decision, but they can't be. It just, as a business grows, everything that you're hoping to achieve in terms of the growth also brings with it challenges in terms of how we manage that decision-making process and make sure that people are engaged and they're taken on the journey. And I think that causes a level of anxiety in the teams, doesn't it? In terms of needing to understand, or else they get left behind and then they might shut down. They're really not bought into the overall vision.
Yeah, absolutely. I think scaling presents all sorts of challenges, doesn't it? In terms of what do you compromise by getting bigger? And often it's sort of intimacy with your clients you might be compromising, or even quality or consistency might be compromised. But sort of that idea of growing to a bigger organization and the implications of decision making, I think is important, because bigger organizations, the decisions that you make have more significance because there's more people. And when you're working, when it's sort of making decisions on behalf of very big organizations, the responsibility and the sort of the burden of that is greater, and the sort of the possibility of getting it wrong will create anxiety, which might make you avoid making that decision, or it might make you fight against doing it in some way. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point.
I think we see that in our own business and with our clients, certainly, that it can cause that inability to make decisions because you're just not able to communicate perhaps with the wider team what it's going to be, or else you might be quite sure of your decision, but then the anxiety comes from how you get everyone to buy into it. And I certainly, that resonates with me in terms of as a collective, we can believe that a decision is the right thing for our business, but how do you get all the intrinsic parts to understand the why? And Mark and I often talk about this, the why. That's when, anxiety as a leader, I can really understand the concept that you're talking about.
Why is definitely important. I think it's a really important question when you're working with an individual, a team, or an organization. Why, I think, is a question that opens rather than sort of closes. I think that sort of that challenge to be inclusive and consultative with organizations and in leadership and decision making is a real challenge, and may not always be possible. It may not be impossible. It might always be possible to involve and include everybody in every decision. What it can do, though, in its sort of more sort of darker aspect, is it can create a culture of dependency where people in organizations become dependent on leaders to make decisions on their behalf. So they're the decision makers, and we don't have any agency or personal authority in relation to that decision. And that kind of, when that culture sort of starts to sort of manifest, what happens is it sort of cuts off creativity and innovation and cooperation and collaboration. These things sort of get sort of, the culture of dependency erodes those good things that you want in an organization, and we start to feel dependent on leaders, and it's a way of people in organizations managing their anxiety by being dependent, or is by finding dependency in the other. And it's of course something that we learned very early on, when we were in fact dependent on the other in our first organization, which is the family, where we were clearly, as infants, very vulnerable and very dependent on our parents, particularly our mother. And then throughout childhood, that sort of dependency is continued. And maybe schools do the same thing, where the education system is about helping us be dependent on a teacher, and then we get a job, and there's this idea of the hero leader, and we're like, we don't have to exercise any of our own agency or personal authority. We can be dependent on this hero leader, and then we wonder why the creativity and the innovation and the cooperation in the organization is low. In the history from, this is, I guess, a systemic idea that it starts very early on and it continues through our culture, and we arrive at sort of, fully cooked in an organization where we don't maybe have the ability to innovate that we might have done as children, who are children at sort of genius levels of innovation compared to us when you sort of assess them. And the longer a child spends in a school, the more their ability to be creative and innovative is sort of reduced.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking about some of the bits you'd written in the book, and I was thinking, actually, as humans, there's really only three things we've ever had to deal with. We kind of use the reptilian brain for survival. That's like, is this gonna kill us or not? We've then got the mammalian brain, which is, to help us raise our young, the next generation, so procreation, survival of the species, and then like the prefrontal cortex is our problem-solving tool. So, and it's almost like the bit which makes us human, what you were talking about there, Gareth, that's the bit we drive out of people at school, right, whether it gets into the workplace. It's all about survival and almost survival of the species, but then we don't allow people to use their prefrontal cortex, which is the bit we really want them to use in a business environment. And that can, I guess I'm looking at it from two angles, really. One is from what you were talking about there. There's almost like the ego of the leader, which is, hey, I'm better than everyone else in the organization, so I will solve these problems because it's my job, and it becomes an egotistical thing. And I guess the other angle is, well, actually, as the leader, we could flip it on its head and say, do you know what? I've got your back. I'm happy for you to take the decisions, but if it goes wrong, I'm still carrying the can. It's still my ultimate responsibility. So then we take complete ownership as the leader, and working around all of those things is how we can not get rid of anxiety, which I'm sure we'll come on to, because anxiety is there, whatever, it's always been there since the last 2 million years. It's not going to go away, but we can work with it rather than against it.
Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, your points about sort of the neuroscience of this is really interesting, and just starting to sort of learn about this myself. And what I understand from the things that I've read is there's an amazing read across to sort of psychoanalytical thinking in terms of how the unconscious and our sort of biology are linked. I mean, the first idea about sort of how do we encourage thinking? How do we encourage thinking and sort of, you talked about rational thinking. And I think that's really important, because in the face of a sort of an anxiety-provoking task, for example, like an organizational change, where something certain and known is going to be transformed in some way to something uncertain and unknown. And the experience of loss and uncertainty creates anxiety. So that question, how can we promote thinking, is a really good one. And it's sort of fundamental or central to the book, The Anxious Leader, where rather than view our anxiety as something that we need to get rid of or something that we need to defend ourselves against and avoid or fight against in some way, we can see it as a source of information, a source of data that tells us something about what's going on, and try and think and try and make sense and meaning of our emotional experience in a way that allows us to have a deeper and richer understanding of what's going on in our organization and going on with people. So that notion of being able to think and promoting rational thinking is really important, because often what you're fighting against is a fantasy. And I sort of use the word fantasy, spelled PH, throughout the book to mean something that we imagine or something that we create in our head as a more acceptable or palatable or more comforting idea of how things are. So rather than face the anxiety of what's really going on in our organization, face the reality of what's really happening, we'll create a fantasy, we'll imagine something and think, no, it's like this. And that relieves anxiety. That sort of, by doing that, that relieves anxiety, but only temporarily. And it's not a mature state of being, because it's taking us away from what's real, from what's really happening in the organization or in our context. So being able to sort of tolerate or bear the discomfort and the sort of pain of anxiety in a way that enables you to think about what's going on in the organization, think about what's going on in the system, is crucially important to sort of leading with anxiety. And without it, we sort of, to go back to your points about neuroscience, the amygdala is in charge, and our leadership is basically run by the amygdala and not by something higher, not by us, if you like. And we're sort of reacting to events rather than sort of leading events or managing events, and we sort of find, and that's when we sort of find ourselves as being stuck as individuals and teams and organizations. There's something there that, in order to think in that way, that's needed, which I think is really about the ability to reflect. So to be able to reflect from what's known as a sort of third position, myself, yourself, the other in this conversation, and then is it possible for me in this moment to sort of put myself up on a balcony, to use a term coined by Ron Heifetz from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, which I sort of go on about quite a lot in the book, and adaptive leadership. He talks about the idea of being on the balcony and the dance floor at the same time. So, and it also relates to this other idea in psychoanalysis called the third position, developed by someone called Ron Britton. So I'm able to sort of be in relationship with myself and the other and be the witness of that relationship at the same time. And it's when we can do that, when we can sort of get up on the balcony and view what's going on whilst we're actually in it, that we're really able to sort of make sense of what's going on and lead in a very sort of purposeful way. And to your point, we might see when our sort of, to use a sort of, I guess, more contemporary understanding of the word ego in the way that you used it, we might understand when the ego is in charge, when some sort of inflation, something narcissistic or grandiose is taking charge of me as a leader, rather than the best interests of what's going on in the system, what's the best interest of the organization, of the business.
Yeah, I think that third perspective is so important, isn't it? And there was a couple of things as you were talking there which were coming to mind. One is, I was actually, Glenda, my wife, we were having this chat over lunch today actually about how, and it's from a book she's reading. I think it's something like Everything You Need You Have, I think the book is called. And also reflecting back on my mindful meditation journey and mindfulness journey. And
yeah,
very much it's kind of the, as leaders, it's just thinking at times, isn't it? Which is, a thought is just a thought. It's no more than that. It's only once we start weighing emotion onto it and we turn it into a reality, and it's just a thought. And being able to just sit with that sometimes, take the third party perspective, look down, it's just finding ways which work for you as a leader to be able to distance yourself. And I was actually listening to a podcast while I was cooking a lovely chicken curry on Saturday night. And this guy was talking about getting sort of sagely wise advice. And he was referring to a thing I'd never heard before, which was called Solomon's paradox. And it's apparently to do with King Solomon back in the day, which is he was very wise, but he lived a kind of pretty wild life himself. And this was the paradox. So this guy has created this practice now where he kind of looks at his Solomon, so himself, he looks at himself as an 85-year-old and he says, right, everything I want to accomplish in life, I've achieved. And that's the 85-year-old me. And every Monday morning for 30 minutes, he sits down and he has a conversation, like almost a coaching or a mentoring session with the 85-year-old himself. Because he said, if I talk to a business coach or a business mentor, they don't know me well enough. I still use them, but they don't know me well enough. I know myself, but I can put myself in the shoes of talking to an 85-year-old me who's been there and done it and succeeded. What would I do? What would that person have done when I'm faced with this, what is effectively an incredibly short-term decision to take in the context of the overall life? And I thought, yeah, I'd never heard of that before, but it's just finding ways how we can all as leaders distance ourselves and take that third-party perspective, isn't it? It's whatever works for you. And there's a couple of things there that I thought, that the meditation, just sit with the thought, or actually, practice talking to an 85-year-old self who has succeeded and been there and done it.
That's really interesting. I think the 85-year-old self is interesting. So Carl Jung talks about the 2 million-year-old man that resides in all of us, that there is that inner wisdom. So like there is the 2 million-year-old human being, try not to gender it as it was done in Jung's time, exists within all of us. And that wisdom, that ancient wisdom, resides within all of us. And I think when you're sort of imagining and sort of sensing into what would it be like to speak to an 85-year-old me, that what you're evoking is that ancient wisdom, is that 2 million-year-old man that Carl Jung referred to. The links, this sort of was a bit of an accident, I guess, or probably slightly inevitable. The links between spiritual practice and the Tavistock tradition and the system psychodynamic occurred to me as I was sort of writing the book, and really from my own practice of leadership and this idea of sort of getting in the third position or getting into up onto the balcony was an idea that I was introduced to on a executive leadership program I did for a year. And it was really about this thing called adaptive leadership. And adaptive leadership was this sort of method of leading developed by two guys from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. They talk about this idea up on the balcony and on the dance floor. And it's really sort of draws on Ron Britton's psychoanalytical idea of the third position. Later, I was sort of introduced to a spiritual practice, or again, slightly by accident, and meditation. I thought to myself, these two practices are similar, and actually one supports the other. So I'm best able to get on the balcony or adopt a third position and see the whole system whilst I'm in it, when I'm present in my body, whilst I'm sort of connected to my body. And that idea, Mark, from meditation that you mentioned about putting distance between yourself and the object is really helpful to this metaphor, in that whether the object is a sort of anxiety, like an emotional object, like something like anxiety, which is difficult, by putting that distance between you and it, you're able to sort of reflect on it and think about it and make sense of it. Or whether it's an object like, what's going on in the system? Why are people behaving like that? How can I make sense of this? What might be happening? What might be driving them? To think like that in a way that's unencumbered by anxiety, because that's what I think anxiety does to the brain. It's experienced in the body. It's an unease, there's a worry, there's a tension, and gets in the way of you thinking clearly. And leaders need to think. So a meditative practice or a mindfulness practice, I think, is really helpful, and it's certainly helped me in leadership, but also in just increasing self-awareness in a way that allows you to sort of think, well, I'm in this situation at work, something's come up and it's made me really anxious. Why is that? What do I know about myself that might explain this? Oh, wow, there's that thing in childhood that happened, or in adolescence that happened, or in early in my life that happened, that might be mobilized in this moment. It kind of reminds me, and I'm kind of connected back to that situation. But then realize that was then and this is now, and I'm no longer a sort of 15-year-old boy. I'm an adult leader with adult capacities, capabilities, and experiences. And my emotional experience doesn't have to be the same.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I joke about this, about sometimes how you're looking around for the adult in the room to actually make the decision, or, deal with the emotional aspects. And I
Right.
think that's because sometimes you can get stuck back in that place. So
Yeah.
you recognize the emotion, you recognize why you're feeling that way, but then you have to sort of fast forward yourself back to real time, don't you, and deal with it. And for that millisecond, you're sort of like, is there a grown up going to take control here? It's
And
not
often it doesn't
regression so
happen.
much. No.
It's we stay in a child. What Eric Byrne. I don't know if you guys have heard of transactional analysis, and the idea of I'm okay, you're okay, and he talked about ego states and the child ego state, and how we can sort of be stuck in that child ego state, and which is often sort of one down or a victim, where we're very sort of vulnerable, and we can stay there and we just don't see it. But I think it's if you're able to sort of get up on the balcony in your inner world, not just sort of in the system of your organization, but sort of your inner balcony, your third position, and you can see, oh wow, I'm doing that, and realize that my experience or how I'm experiencing this event is out of place. It's out of time. It's not relevant or appropriate. It belongs in this sort of archaic time, this point in time that I've surpassed. But the body doesn't really know. And I think one of the things that really interferes with our ability to adult in the way that you described, Becky, is trauma. And trauma can sort of have and I'm no expert on this, but other than through my own experience of trauma, but I'm no expert on the neuroscience of how it works. But I understand that it can sort of ingrain itself or imprint itself. So the trauma creates an impression and an imprint. And the brain doesn't know that you're no longer in that precarious situation. You're no longer in that threatening situation. And when events and circumstances show up in life, and often in organizational life, because we take ourselves we don't leave our emotional stuff at home. We don't leave our personal history at home. When we walk through the office door or turn on the Teams, it's all there with us. And it can get in the way, and it can stop us from seeing things as they are. And we can be recalled to an earlier traumatic experience from childhood, and it can feel, as far as the body's concerned and the brain is concerned, that it's just the same as it was, and we can be overwhelmed by that, which is difficult.
It is difficult because, we talk a lot, we have done on this podcast and with our teams, about authentic leadership as well, and showing up as your true self. But you have to manage those aspects of yourself as well, don't you? Because otherwise you can't lead as such. You can't lead with purpose, and you can't assure people that you have got this and it's okay. So it's a very fine balance. And we've talked a lot about that on the podcast in the past. But I think that juggling act is with us all.
Yeah.
Just going back to your point about being on the balcony and taking yourself off the dance floor, I've seen that used in a team situation to make the team sort of an exec step back from a decision as well, step back from the detail, and to actually focus on the bigger picture. So I think that has so many different uses, doesn't it? But I completely understand how as an individual you can do that, but also encourage your team to do that when they get too stuck in the weeds a little bit.
Absolutely.
And to take yourself up on the balcony.
Absolutely, and see the whole system, and look at it. Try and look at it impartially and objectively. Just something you said a moment ago, Becky, I just want to sort of go back to, if it's okay, which is, you said the term aspects of yourself. And I think that finding your true self or your authentic self is quite a task, isn't it? And I'm sure there's sort of some yogis out there who managed to do it. The idea that I am multitudes, that, I am sort of multiple eyes, or there are very many parts to me, is quite useful, or aspects, as you put it. The idea that there's this part of me that might have been formed earlier in life that can show up at different points. But there's also this other part of me that knows what to do and is competent and confident. And how these different parts of me sort of interact and interrelate is really important. And I guess the authentic self in that metaphor really is the witness of that, is the part of you, if it is in fact a part and not actually who you really are, that's able to witness all of that, all those different parts, and observe what's going on. And it's from that vantage point of the observer that I think you're able to sort of lead authentically and choose consciously your leadership, rather than, let anxiety choose it for you. Let the amygdala make the decisions.
The other thing I was just going to touch on there, Gareth, Becky and yourself, they were talking almost about, at times we have to get out of the weeds and get to a higher level. Equally, anxiety can lead to overwhelm, which means we need to actually get down into the weeds to break it down for people, because it become overwhelming, either for us as leaders. We just can't see the wood for the trees. So I think depending on what it is, it can actually, it's not fixed, is it? It could be either. We might need to get up out of the detail to avoid the anxiety, or we might need to go back down further just to break it down. And a classic example would be when someone in the team says, I don't know which way to turn. I've got so much on. I just feel completely overwhelmed and it's stressing me out and I can't sleep. And then you sit down with them and you go through it and they've got like 3 things to do, but they're just, it's become so out of proportion because the anxiety is completely kicked in and they're panicking. They're just hitting complete panic. So it's almost like, I guess, anxiety can rise beyond anxiety to overwhelming stress and panic. And it's as leaders, how do we manage that within ourselves? And also, how do we recognize that within the team as well? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think that the sort of overwhelm or panic should really be seen as a sort of a signal. We get the word pan from the sort of the Greek god Pan, or the sort of prefix pan of panic from the god Pan, and Pan's role was to warn armies of the enemy sort of coming over the hill, and the way he would do that is with a sort of with a screech, a deafening, piercing, sort of heart-stopping screech or scream, and that's where we get the word panic from. This overwhelming enemy is on its way. But I think sort of seeing it for what it really is in its origins is a signal. It's a message. How we respond to that message is down to us, or it could be down to us if we're able to sort of see it consciously. So we could panic in its regular and run around like headless chickens and just oh my god, or we could do what I think you're suggesting, Mark, which is and Becky, which is sort of get up on the balcony and okay, what's going on here? How can we make sense of this? Is this panic real, or is it something that we've imagined in our head? There's this great British academic that I really like, a guy called Keith Grint, and he talks about wicked issues and wicked problems. So problems that are complex and uncertain and volatile, ambiguous, complex, that are sort of problems that are sort of entrenched, have no easy answer, that involve different tribal interests and habits and patterns and are very difficult and seem unsolvable. He calls those wicked issues or wicked problems. And what he recommends for situations like that is a leadership style that involves learning. He actually calls it leadership, and by his definition of leadership is how we mobilize systems and people to tackle tricky problems or wicked issues, and the method of doing that is learning. Whenever we experience a problem that's wicked, the remedy should be okay. Let's learn, and getting up on the balcony and seeing the bigger picture, trying to make sense of what's going on is what's asked for. As opposed to the two other sorts of context or situation that Grint talks about. One is sort of tame issues, which are sort of you can do, which are issues that are known. So wicked issues are novel, not experienced before. A tame issue is a problem that we've had before. Like there'll be many tasks in for an accountancy firm that like doing the annual accounts is not a novel issue. We have to do it every year, and we know how to do it. And what we can do is we can apply a standard operating procedure to doing the accounts. But then also, as an organization, we'll come across wicked issues and we'll need to apply learning. The third sort of issue, or the third sort of challenge that Grint talks about, is crises. And for a crisis, that's when he recommends command and control, or command. So like if the house is on fire, it's not like let's get up on the balcony and have a think about what's going on. or it's about, okay, everybody get out. And that sort of context requires a commander to take charge. But most of the problems we deal with that are really sort of vexing in terms of our time and our mental capacity are wicked issues, ones that we need to learn about. And often that means thinking differently about the hierarchy of the organization and seeing leaders as facilitators of learning rather than those that have the answers. And that might mean leaders having another confrontation with anxiety in terms of how they can present themselves as being open and vulnerable in a way that invites creativity and cooperation, that invites openness. And often I think that that's to lead in an anxious context, in an uncertain context. That's what's needed from leaders, is to be vulnerable and open in a way that facilitates openness, facilitates learning, but not so vulnerable and open that followers lose confidence in them. So that's quite a risk when we show our vulnerability as leaders. It's necessary. If you show up as vulnerable all the time, it's not going to have the right impact, because you're going to lose your currency with your team, and they'll start feeling anxious that, oh my God, my leader's always vulnerable and I don't believe them anymore. So vulnerability is like something you use, I wouldn't say sparingly, but you use choicefully. Consciously, there you go.
And it's also the team have to be bold as well. We have to have the environment where the team will be bold. And there's a couple of things. One is, I've got a quote up on, I had it on my office wall. I don't know where it is. I think it's in a folder somewhere. And it was it was a Second World War American general who said, if everyone's thinking the same, then someone ain't thinking. And that kind of, I've used that with my team as well, which is, I want you to challenge me. I want you to, just because I say this is my opinion, I want you to put your genuine opinion forward. And we had a previous guest on the show who gave an example, and Antonio Garrido. He gave a great example. I think it was George W. Bush Sr., and he was ex-president then. He was out of the White Office, and he just played a game of golf, and a reporter went up to him and he said something about the game of golf, and he said, you know what, I've never lost as many games of golf in my life as now I'm not president anymore, because people were obviously throwing the game just so he could win because he was the president. And I think we can all suffer from that within our businesses at times. So yes, we have to be vulnerable, we have to create the environment, but we also need to build the competency and the confidence and the right people around us who will challenge us as leaders as well, not just kind of defer to us all of the while.
Absolutely. I think that's true. I mean, it sounds like you are creating that environment in your team, Mark. Telling people to challenge and question me might not be the most effective way of doing it. I guess by playing golf for someone, George W. Bush is sort of inferring the possibility that he might lose, but he never did, because nobody had the guts to beat the president. And what shows up there is our relationship to authority. So whilst you might be sort of moving around the world thinking, I'm Mark, I'm a nice guy, I'm a family guy, I like people, they like me. What's going on in your organization might be different in terms of how people relate to you because of your positional power, because of the authority that you have in the organization, and how we relate to people in authority. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a change in behavior for you. And my hunch is it doesn't mean a change in behavior for you, but it might mean thinking, I'm wondering what I represent to this person in my team. I'm wondering how their model, remember, developed in childhood, their model of authority and leadership and authority figures that was developed in childhood, how that's being attributed to me and how that's showing up, and how I might need to be with them in order for them to be the creative and open person that or open team that I want them to be.
I think that's a brilliant learning, isn't it? What do I represent to this person? That's such a powerful thing that we could just all sort of take through life with us, really. Think about how, we'll get more out of people, we'll get the best out of people if we think about how we are coming across to them and how to get the best out of them.
Absolutely. And I think there's something about our position in an organization that has a big bearing on that. And there's also something about difference, about our race and gender, sexuality, or how we identify, how that impacts on a relationship, and how it sort of can make us do things and stop us from doing things.
That's a whole other subject that we could get into.
It is, but it creates a lot of anxiety. I guess the other thing, one of the things that you're talking about, Mark, which what I inferred from what you're talking is about how you're really trying to create. Professor Amy Edmondson from Harvard talks about in terms of psychological safety and how you're sort of working to create that psychological safety. And in the book, I talk about what I feel are some of the sort of psychoanalytical roots of psychological safety in the work of sort of Wilfred Bion, his idea of the container and the contained, and Donald Winnicott and the idea of the sort of the holding environment. Role, I think, is important for leaders as well, which is how do I contain anxiety? So you've got that task, which we've talked quite a lot about how do I manage my own emotions? How do I make sure that I'm in charge rather than the amygdala? But then there's something about, and you guys will, as leaders, you would have experienced this firsthand. How do I contain the emotions of my team? So you're going through a difficult project, a challenging period at work, and people are feeling anxious. And they're looking to you as leader how to be. And they'll want to put their anxieties, it sounds a little bit weird, in you for you to hold. And hold means not throw right back at them. When they express something of their anxiety, it's not like, oh God, yeah, me too, or it's not sort of, well, you can't, you've got no time to feel like that. You've got to crack on with this. It's the ability to hold their experience and hold your experience, which I think it makes leadership doubly hard because you've got your anxiety and your followers' anxiety to contain and to hold if the organisation is going to be effective.
Yeah, and as Becky said, we could do another 5 podcasts off this one, and there we're starting to move into the realms in my world of enhancing your own emotional intelligence as a leader, because equally, if that person comes to you at that point in time and they're angry, they could be angry. The anxiety and stress could be turning into outright frustration and anger. Sort of almost turning into Sigmund Freud at that point and saying, so Gareth, I sense you're quite angry here. Tell me, where do you think this is driving from? At that point, they're probably going to dive across the desk and grab hold of your necktie, which is why I don't wear one now. It's too dangerous, Let's have one like the police have, which pulls off. So actually, there's then the point of, okay, give them the space. Every fire will burn itself out once the fuel disappears, and maybe the next day is the time to have the conversation. This is where we get into emotional intelligence of leadership, and as we say, that's a whole new podcast, isn't it? So we probably haven't got time to go there today, and very, very conscious of your time, Gareth. So please respond to that, and then we're going to move into our final 2 stock questions.
Well, just to say about emotional intelligence, I think I've got 3 Daniel Goleman books on the shelf behind me. Groundbreaking work that was done in the 90s. I think from the sort of Tavistock tradition, the invitation would be to think not just about the individual in front of you that might be anxious, but to think about the group and to think what's going on in the system that might be making this person anxious. How is this person holding the anxiety of the group? How are they communicating something on behalf of the group? So it's rather thinking about emotional intelligence 2.0, where you're thinking about how can I use this emotional intelligence as data? So intelligence as in military intelligence, and that's probably the sort of the build I'd offer on in terms of emotional intelligence is like it's great, use it to regulate yourself, but also use it to think about, okay, what does that mean about what's going on and what's being expressed potentially on behalf of the group.
Oh, we could talk about this for a long time.
I'll come back. It's lovely speaking to you. It's lovely speaking to you guys. I'm happy to come back.
So, Gareth, as always, we asked you if you could recommend 3 books, podcasts, or something similar along the themes of what we've spoken about today that our listeners would enjoy. So, what would you like to recommend?
Oh, I forgot that bit, that our listeners would enjoy.
Well, it helps.
I'm going to have to go back. I have to come back next week. I can't promise that. So what I've got 3 books. I've just picked them up. So I said I'll do it in this order because we've been speaking about it quite a lot. I've got this book here. This is The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky, and they're from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. It's an amazing institution, and really this is all about the adaptive leadership that I've sort of referred to. What I didn't realize, I was into this for years, what I didn't realize, its roots are in the Tavistock and with somebody called A.K. Rice, who went over to America, and it's like a group relations expert, and they learned a lot from him, and he's referenced a lot in Ron Heifetz's other book, which is called I think Leadership with No Answers, or Leadership Without Easy Answers. That book is probably been the leadership book that's meant most to me throughout my leadership career and coaching and consulting also.
Excellent. So good recommendation. Thank you.
I hope so. You should enjoy it. If you like reading textbooks.
What else have you
nerdy
got?
as I am, you like reading textbooks, you'll enjoy it. But if you're looking for something a bit softer, you're not going to enjoy it. So here's one. Again, this is called the Bhagavad Gita, and this is a classic spiritual text, sort of foundation of Hinduism. It's a story, an allegory of Prince and his advisor on a battlefield in northern India. And really what it's about is a battle in our minds and our attachment with all sorts of objects. And I've read this book several times. It's full of highlights, notes, things like that. And I was looking at it today, and I'm gonna read it. I'm gonna read it again. It's basically a poem. It's a long poem. It's amazing. I've learned so much from it, and I think really it's all in there. Probably that's the Bhagavad Gita.
The fact that you can pronounce that is brilliant.
Absolutely.
But I love the fact that you've highlighted it and things. I think that's when it shows that you really love a book. You're so
definitely
into it.
And we'll be relying on producer Lizzie to get the right link in the show notes to that book as well.
Oh, brilliant. I've got books on my shelf that I've not read, and I've got books on my shelf that I've read 5 times. I've got one book that I've read 9 times, which I'm not recommending today, but this one I've read several times as well. It's called What Matters Most, and it's by James Hollis. James Hollis is probably my favourite contemporary author. I guess it's a sort of psychology book. He's in his 80s now. He was disturbed to go into a bookstore in his hometown of Washington, D.C. and see his books in the self-help section when he thought he was a psychologist. Well, he's actually... I can't find my book. It's over here, sir. Self-help? Okay. He is a Jungian analyst and author of several books. This book's called What Matters Most, Living a More Considered Life. And it's really about finding purpose and meaning in life in the middle passage, sort of knowing your age. We all shared our age at the beginning of the podcast. We're all sort of in that. We're all sort of midway through life's journey. And it sort of helps you sort of reflect on where you've got to and how you're going to sort of spend the second half of your life.
Well, I can honestly say I've not read any of those 3. So as they're going to go on my list of books to get. Definitely. Thank you for that, Gareth. So final question before we let you go. If you could go back in time and speak to an 18-year-old Gareth, what 3 bits of advice would you try and impart on yourself?
It's a fantastic question, isn't it? And I love the people that you've interviewed before. I love their answers. Some amazing answers. So much sort of floods to me when asked that question in terms of advice that I would give myself at 18. And I started writing a list and I couldn't even sort of divide it down to sort of 3 things. But where I got to was the reflection that asking the question kind of promotes the fantasy that we can get to a point in adulthood where we haven't suffered, where we haven't made mistakes, we have in some way avoided the experience of life and the suffering that's inherent in development growth. I mean, I might tell my 18-year-old self that that I love him and I'll see you when you get here, but you're on your own. Because I think that without sort of experiencing those mistakes, those regrets, without being harmed and harming others and experiencing the anxiety of that, you don't learn, you don't develop, and you arrive at sort of middle life and the midlife and the middle passage without the questions that you need to get you through the second half of life.
Yeah, all experiences are valuable, good or bad. Their experiences. Yeah, I love that answer. I think that's great. I probably would say to myself, buy as many houses as you could in 1993, Mark, and then probably sell them in about 2020. but apart from that, I'm with you 100%.
That's the Back to the Future, isn't it? That's the Back to the Future answer. This is a great answer.
Gareth, this has been absolutely fantastic and fascinating and interesting for Becky and I as well. And yeah, we would love to have you back on at some point, because there is so many areas we could have gone into, and we just did not have the time to go into it. So thank you for your experience, and every success with the book and your future as an executive coach.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking to both of you. Thank you. I'm very grateful. It's good to be here.
So if people wanted to reach out to you, Gareth, where's the best place for them to find you?
LinkedIn's a great place to reach out to me, or I have a website, which is reconnectcoaching.co.uk, which is also really easy to contact me through the website.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for your time. You've been incredibly generous.
Thank you both. Thank you.
So Becky, that was fascinating. I think we've learned a lot today about anxiety and what it actually means for us as leaders in our team. And as normal, we're going to pick out our 3 top things that we took away. So did you want to kick off with the first point?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Really, really interesting. So my first point was about reflecting from a third position. And I'd heard this used before in a team context about stepping off the dance floor and up onto the balcony. But I think talking about it as a leader and as an individual really resonated with me about how, if you step back and look at it from that position, you have a much better view. And we've talked about it before. It's about that pressing pause to reflect, isn't it? And to maybe reset as well. So reflecting from the third position, or as I'm going to remember it, up on the balcony, really valid point that I'll take away.
Yeah, definitely. I love that point, and it is a challenging thing to do as well, isn't it? Because I think very often we talk in the well I think this, or if you put yourself in someone else's shoe, well they think this, but it's actually getting outside of both of those thought processes and being that neutral observer, which it's a real challenge, but highly valuable, as you're saying. So the point I took away, it was when Gareth was talking about wicked problems, and how wicked problems by their definition are novel, so they've never come up before. And it was very much around leaders being facilitators of learning rather than knowing the answers, and a great way to get your team to get involved in the problem solving process and not just look up to you as the leader for the solutions all of the time. And I thought that was a great point. So wicked problems, that really stood out for me.
Yeah, and then you went on to talk about how empowering your team to think and to challenge is so important as well. So yeah, I agree. A great point there. And the third point for me that really resonated today is just to think about, what do I represent to the team? How are they perceiving me? And Gareth talked about it as being, if you're in a position of authority and that you might have those long held views of what authority means from childhood. And we need to look at ourselves and step back again and just think about, how do the team see me, and how can I adapt my style probably to get the best out of the team and to make it work for everybody.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, Becky, haven't we? How, we're just Mark and Becky, aren't we? But we don't represent that to other people in our teams, because we're old and scary and senior and all those things that come with authority, as Gareth was talking about as well. So, having those conversations with individuals rather than just as a collective to find out, really get under the skin of what you represent to them can be hugely valuable as a leader. So that brings us to the end of today's show. Everything we've talked about of any relevance will be in the show notes, including the links to those 3 fabulous books which Gareth mentioned as well. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, then why not rate and review us? Giving us a 5-star rating helps other people find this show. Also, a massive thank you to our sponsors, Larkin Gowan. Take a look at the link to their website to see how their team of experts can help you in your business. And finally, have a great week, everybody, and remember to boost your health, wealth, and self.